I think that the tools are trying to decomplicate and uncomplicate sales as opposed to further complicate. That may not be what they're doing.
Hello Sales Nation, I'm Will Barron, host of the Salesman podcast, and welcome to today's show. On today's show we have Bridget Gleason, VP of Sales over at Sumo Logic, and I ask her the question which makes up the total of the show of, is sales too complicated? Or are we, salespeople and sales managers and everyone above us, are we over-complicating the process? Bridget gives some fascinating insights on this episode because she is a practitioner. She is actively and proactively both making things more complex with software, tools, and stripping them away as well of her sales team to make them more efficient. You can find out more about Bridget over at salesman.red in the show notes. And with that all said, let's jump into today's episode. Hi, Bridget, and welcome to the Salesman podcast.
Hello, Will. How are you?
I'm very well. I'm excited to have you on the show and excited to dive into a topic which probably every generation of sales comes up. And I think it's super important to wrap our heads around now as, the mainly millennial sales audience that we have listening to this. And that is the overarching question of today's show: are we overcomplicating sales? So I'm a B2B salesperson at heart. I still sell the ad space on the podcast. So I'm still a practitioner. I'm still getting into all of this. I'm still learning from each of the guests that come on, like yourself, Bridget. And it seems that every other show I do, every other piece of advice I get is try this new tool, try this more complicated sales process, try this. And what I want to get at and start the show with is just to get your thoughts on the question, I guess. Are we overcomplicating sales in 2016 right this moment through throwing tools at problems that perhaps better trained salespeople could solve on their own?
I think that the tools are trying to decomplicate and uncomplicate sales as opposed to further complicate. That may not be what they're doing. I get pitched, Will, day after day after day, all kinds of tools to sell to my team. And because I've also worked for a company that was in that tool space, I happen to have a pretty good basis of understanding around what these tools are and what the promise is. The idea around most of them is I think, two things. It's to uncomplicate sales, and it's to help specialize so that we're learning a lot around the importance of specialization and how that can help in the sales process. I think, though, right now, there is this flurry of tools and promises. And I'll tell you, for me as a sales leader, I don't know that I would say it's complicated. They're confusing, and there's a lot of overlap. And I am a reluctant purchaser of these tools until there's a really clear value proposition and one that is targeted at a very specific problem that they're solving. Because I'll tell you something, these tools get put in, and a lot of them as point solutions can be interesting and probably very worthwhile, but you get a whole bunch of them and sales reps are moving along their day. They don't get implemented. There's not a good process around them, and they sit wasted, and they're expensive. It all adds up. So I would say it's complicating things, even though I think their intent is to uncomplicate, which is sort of ironic.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that precisely. And you said something interesting then, used the word, they promise to do these things. Does that sum it up then, that perhaps some sales tools, for example, for me, sales email tracking and tracking opens is super useful. There's so many platforms that do it really well. And they're all trying to differentiate themselves by throwing in other stuff on top of it, on top of that core mechanism. So is perhaps the promise that we'll do email tracking and all this other stuff the complicating bit versus we need email tracking, if that makes sense?
Well, I had a conversation yesterday with the CEO of a startup company who's actually doing work around something that I think is ultimately interesting and could be important. conversation, so voice conversation analysis. And I kept asking him, when I was asking him what problem it was solving, so what? So what? What will that give me? If so, you can tell me how if a sales rep talks 20% of the time or 80% of the time. So what? How am I going to use that? And how does that stack up compared to all the other tools that I'm using? And which one is really going to give me the more bang for the buck? And so to answer your question, Will, when like there's the email tracking and all the things they add on top of it, of all the things they add on top of it, which of those should I really care about? Because the trick and the important thing is not tracking everything and paying attention to everything. It's knowing the one or two things I should pay attention to, the one or two metrics that are important, the one or two things that are going to move the needle. And until a company can tell me or product can tell me, okay, this of all the things you're doing is going to help them move the needle to get to whatever it is problem they're trying to solve. Is it more revenue per rep? Is it around training? Is
And
it around
let me just jump in
consistency?
for a second. From your
Yeah.
experience, what are these one or two things? Because I imagine they keep cropping up, and they're generally they are similar things that crop up in different companies.
Okay, so there's depending on which part of the sales process you're looking at, and again, we get to the specialization in which sales function. But I'll give you some broad examples of what I mean. It's very expensive to ramp a rep. So things you can do that can shorten the length of time it takes to ramp a sales rep to productivity, that's an important metric to look at. A conversion metric. So let's say I look across my reps. Let's say I have 10 reps. And again, you've got to look at conversion ratios going from one stage to the next. So let's say rep 1 has a 90% conversion between demo and close, and rep 2 has 50%. I need to know, okay, so what can I do to help reps get a higher conversion rate? So there are different, what's the average revenue per deal? Like deal size. Is it going to increase deal size? Is it going to increase how long it takes to get that first contact?
And what really practically is an example of something that does affect these things if we narrow down on it?
Okay, so let's take email tracking. Email tracking is an interesting one. So let's say that I send out as a sales rep 500 emails. And I need to know, I only have a limited amount of time. Time is something a salesperson cannot manufacture. So limited amount of time, which ones should I follow up on? Email tracking, if I can now prioritize and see who's opened an email, who's clicked on a link, and even who spent time perhaps on something that I've sent, and then prioritize my time that way. So it gives me a better idea. Here are the people who are perhaps more interested or qualified. That's a very useful, functional tool and metric to be thinking about.
And from that then, because I feel like our conversation so far, tools are useful, and of course, this can be software, this can be hiring people like sales assistants, things of that nature as well. It doesn't have to be a software product. But it seems like there's two goals of this. One, to increase the efficiency of the salesperson, and then two, to increase the conversion rate of the leads coming in or the leads generated. Should we just be focusing and uncomplicating the whole process and just focusing on those two things alone? And would that make our lives easier as sales professionals?
It's a piece of the puzzle. Like, I wish we could distill it down to just that. Here's what I believe is important, is that, the habit, and habit is really important, and getting good at something. So when I get really good at demo to close, let's say my conversion ratio, that allows me then to go focus on another aspect of maybe where I want to get better in sales so that I can continue to progress my career. So I think there's a limited number of things that we can address and look at any given period of time. So the more that you can make a certain one habit or really master something and get a skill, I can go tackle something else. And that's how we progress as salespeople. So I think we're oversimplifying if we say, okay, let's just focus on those two things, and those are the only two things to pay attention to. I think a sales leader's challenge is I can't focus on them all at once. I've got to identify which ones am I going to focus on at this particular period of time. Where are my pain points?
Okay, brilliant. So we can attack this question probably backwards then from where I started of. For the B2B sales professional listening to this show right now, they've got so many options of things that they can improve. They can improve it with software. They can improve it by reading books, getting mentoring, coaching. So there's lots of options to improve on whatever they're going to look at. But how do they know what is going to be the biggest bang for buck thing to improve on? Because then they can focus on that one thing, and then that'll simplify it, because once they get past that one thing, they can of course then move on to the next, and of course that happens then for the rest of their career.
Will, God love you for that question. That is a great question. and and I really think this is where a good manager is really helpful. And again, when you think about tools, where tools can also be really helpful, and metrics. My teams over the years, there's not a team that doesn't complain about my requirements and rigor and discipline around reporting and metrics and conversion and ratios. But the reason I do it is so that the sales rep can see, oh, here's where I have the biggest issue. Here's where I'm having a problem. I'm not able to get past the first conversation, or I'm not able to get that first conversation. And then you can pull it apart and say, okay, I am going to then address this one. I'm going to start at the beginning. I'm going to work on, what do I need to do to get that first conversation? Is it, I need to write better emails. I need to improve the tone and the way that I talk when I am calling a prospect. Maybe it's leaving a voicemail. Maybe it's my LinkedIn connections and how I use my network. But once I pull it apart and I would pick one thing, one area. And we've all got areas. It should be very easy to pick one. And we pick one and we really work on that one until we start to see improvement there. And again, that's where metrics and data is really important, because done correctly, we can start to see that progress over time. And that's super helpful.
Mm-hmm. And to get really practical with this again, Bridget, perhaps you don't have a a sales manager who's reporting all of this data back to you and is guiding you. And I've had good and bad sales managers over the years that I worked in medical device sales. Some of them were very good of saying, more bluntly than others, of you suck at this, you need to work on this, and everything else will improve from it. Some, I can think of one in particular, was just a terrible sales manager. He was very good at sucking up to VP staff above him, and so he was always highly regarded internally, but I got no coaching off him, no mentorship, no feedback of focus on this or focus on that. So I had to do a lot of it myself. So I've got some thoughts on this. But the salesperson in that position is the sensible thing then to do, as you described, of start at the top of the funnel and then work your way down, suss out how you can, I guess, go to one of your colleagues perhaps, see what they're doing, how many leads they're bringing in, what their initial conversion rate is down the funnel, and then focus on getting to that point and then moving downwards. Is that the best way to go about it if you've perhaps not got that support that you obviously give?
Will, I love your questions. It's almost as if I planted these questions and I didn't even know that I planted them. As salespeople, and because I am just a huge fan of the sales profession, and what it can provide someone in terms of a skill set and learning and career path. This is really important to me, and I think that we have to be our own best sales manager also, because as you said, I I am not going to put my career into the hands of anyone else ever. It's going to be in my hands, and I think great salespeople to take their career into their own hands. And one of the most important things for a salesperson to do is to understand their own metrics and what they're good at and what they're not, and to deconstruct after every call and at the end of every day what worked and what didn't. We have to be great archaeologists of what went on. And as you said, you can go to a colleague, you can listen to podcasts, you can read books, there are lots of ways to do it, but we have to be our own best advocate, our own best sales manager. And I've also found that the best salespeople, the ones who have the highest conversion rates and close the most deals and make the most money, are the ones that are also the biggest students of the profession and are always reading, always learning, always taking classes, always trying something new. And so we can't rely. It's great if you have a manager that will help shepherd you along. And I think that's for sales reps that look to be managers. I think this is a primary responsibility, is to enable, empower, educate your reps. But in the absence of that, we need to do that for ourselves. Critical.
And other than the CRM, which you can perhaps pull data from if you've got the access to and all that stuff, and you've got probably the bit of slightly more tech savvy perhaps to get into some of that kind of thing, and to put it into context, the last company I worked for, $1 billion company, medical device company, had no CRM system whatsoever. So this isn't applicable to everyone. How do they gather that data and those metrics? Is it as simple as having a pad of paper and you just jot down the number of calls you make versus number of conversations versus, how you rated the conversation, perhaps write down some objections that came up so you can see if they come up regularly? Is that the best way to go about it if you don't have a one-click button to give you all the data itself?
Yes. So I'll also get a little bit tactical with this. First of all, even companies that have the one-click data, it's amazing how many of them, it's a poorly set up instance of Salesforce. The data is inaccurate. So there's no silver bullet. So I don't want anyone listening to think, gosh, if only I had that, it would be easy. There's still issues with that. For good or for bad, I've been around long enough that I didn't have a CRM either that was giving me that information. So on the tactical side, Will, what you're saying is actually very true. I would keep track every day. How many calls did I make? How many am I getting through? And not only that, is I would always set objectives for every day, every meeting, number of calls, whatever it was. And I would look, let's say, for example, I'm going to call 20 companies every day. How many am I getting through to, and is that number improving? Easy. Then another thing that I would look at is, all right, when I do reach someone, I've got this script and I have an objective. And my objective is, I want to see if they'll give me time. I probably didn't catch them at a good time. Will they give me time to meet them or have a conversation with them later? That's my goal. And I look at, did I achieve that? Did I not? And then I would look at, not only did I do it, why? Why on this call did they say yes? What did they do? What did I do differently on this? And again, I could look to other people to help me do that. But just even me, myself, that was a daily practice that I did for all the years that I was an individual contributor and selling.
What percentage of salespeople do you think have a set sales process, have objectives for each step of the sales process or each contact, and are working in that methodical manner?
Okay, so I have two answers to it. One is I think very few salespeople have the discipline, or I don't know what it is, the
Yeah.
discipline, the know how to do that on their own. So I would say it's a very small percentage, 10%. I would say then there's a percentage of sales reps where it is mandated and required. And again, it's painful and compliance is an issue. But we got to the point at Sumo Logic where it was a requirement. I made it a requirement of my managers, who then made it a requirement of their reps, that they needed to have a certain amount of detail and these things talked about. And this is the call plan. And we standardized and really drove compliance across the team. So I've got great compliance at Sumo Logic because it's enforced compliance. Um, in the absence of that, how many of the reps would be doing that on their own? Less than 10%. And I don't think it's a matter, Will, of laziness. It's maybe not understanding its importance, not knowing what really to put in place. There's a certain amount of discipline. For good or for bad, I am super disciplined. I mean, I just am. I have schedules. I have routine. That's how I thrive. And so that's a really important thing to me. And I would say that great sales reps tend to be either disciplined by nature, or they learn how to be disciplined in their, because time, we can't manufacture time. And so you've got to be a great time manager, and that requires a lot of discipline.
So I'm going to ask you how we can perhaps improve our discipline to wrap up this part of the show in a second. But I just want to, again, add a bit of context to this from my perspective, because I have poor discipline. Even now, even though I'm putting out, an audio, video podcast every single day, and of course doing these interviews and doing all the editing, all the marketing that goes along with it. And we've grown from essentially nothing to 10 to 20,000 downloads a day over the past 6-7 months, from literally me. You can see this here. It's harder to see on YouTube. This is literally my living room, just plowing out content and working from that perspective. But I'm still super undisciplined because it takes me, and we talked about it on the show before, I have to really I have a battle with myself every time I have to sit down and do anything, because I feel like I'm being forced to do it. I felt this in sales as well. Of one company I worked in particular, they had a very regimented of is a field-based medical device sales role, but every phone call had to go in the CRM. And obviously you're getting phone calls while you're driving in your car and that kind of thing. So you have to, literally they wanted you to stop, pull over at the service station, log the call, go back to your work. And that never worked very well with me, purely because of my lack of discipline in that regard. And I got into trouble all the time. And of course, then I always hit my target. So the trouble kind of disappeared every quarter.
That'll do it. That's right.
Exactly. So that wasn't so relevant. But I know for a fact with more discipline, I probably would have done more deals in less time with less stress. And this is kind of sums up the question I asked at the beginning of the show of the answer might be just, if you're disciplined and you have a process in place, sales isn't all that complex until you get down to the human communications, and there's a lot of your DNA that goes into that. But all that aside, I'm really intrigued at this. So you are, clearly naturally disciplined. What do you do, or how do you coach someone in a sales team who isn't disciplined? Is it just a case of, this is what you've got to do? If you don't do it, we'll be saying goodbye in 6 months, or there's pressure that builds into it, or is there a better way of going about it?
Super good question. Everyone is not going to be naturally disciplined, like I said. So I try to limit and really have it at a minimum the number of non-negotiables, to give room for a lot of different styles and personalities that can work in sales. It's one of the things I love about it, is a salesperson should be able to have a certain amount of creativity and flexibility and doing it their way. But there are certain pieces that are non-negotiables that need to be there in order to move a sales process along and have good results. back to some of the tools, the reasons that I like some of the tools is it takes away the need for you to go and then put the stuff in the CRM. Anything that I could do to help you, that you're not having to do this mindless activity of entering into a CRM, things that probably the reason you may think of it as undisciplined, where in reality, I think there are tasks that just they're not engaging you in the way that is fulfilling to you. And yes, you have to do them, but it's harder for you to get over that. So anything that I can do to remove the obstacle and help that to get in there and unlock this creativity, because the human dynamic is where I really need your brain power. Mm. That's where I need you as a human that I can't do with a machine or a tool. So I see there are certain tasks that a tool can do that will not require the discipline. And then the things that I'm asking you to do that do require discipline are smaller in number. And then I think then you've got something that's manageable between like the rep and the manager contract that's important.
Nice. I love that. So it's you're setting a framework in place, I guess, of non-negotiables, and then you're taking willpower out of the equation a little bit from that perspective,
right?
Of I've got to do this. There's no choice in the matter. It's got to be done by this time on a Friday. So you don't need to think about where it's going to go, how to plan it. I guess at that point you can just do it. It takes away some of the discipline.
Right. And I've had, these were sales engineers, but I would require a weekly report from them done at the end of the week. And it needed to be in my inbox by 5 p.m. on a Friday. And after a couple of times, 2 times, and when I say a couple, I mean 2, when they missed it, and I said to each of them independently, they were the first 2 that I had hired on this team. I said, you know what? This is a non-negotiable. And this is career limiting, at least with me. I'm not gonna ask you. I'm not gonna bug you. When I'm not asking for a lot of things. When I say I need something by a certain time, I need it. There are tools that can remind you to send it to me. Figure it out. And what they ended up doing, Will, is not only did they have a reminder to send it, but they had it scripted that it collected all the information I asked for, and they automated the whole thing. They never thought about it again, which I thought was brilliant. I got what I needed. I just needed the information. I didn't need them to be in pain. And it got to me when I needed it. They had it set up, and it was fine. So wherever a tool can do it, I think that is beautiful for people that do have trouble because for whatever reason of adhering. And then they could focus on other things that they were not able, that a tool was unable to do.
Good stuff. Well, Bridget, I've got a couple of questions to ask everyone that comes on the show. The first one I want to ask you is, which do you prefer, selling or management?
I love management, but and I've been talking to people about this recently, but I need to also be involved in selling. So I'm not answering.
Okay, gun to head. You've got to choose one or the other.
Well, I would pick management because I think the fact that I'm in management and not an individual contributor, it would make a liar of me if I said, well, I enjoy selling more, but I'm a manager. I would say that in a VP of sales role, I have to also be careful that I don't take on a role or become, for me, the VP of sales that's always behind spreadsheets and numbers and metrics and tools, but that I do get that customer interaction because that's a really important, that's where I learn everything. It's super important. It's interesting. It's gauging. It makes me a better leader, more empathetic. It's just part and parcel to my role, but I would have to say manager, gun to head.
Nice. Okay, next one. Dollar size, if possible. What's the biggest deal you've ever closed?
Now you're really stretching my memory because I have not been an individual contributor for a long time, but it was probably in the late 90s. It was a deal at Stryker Endoscopy. God, a 3-year deal, couple million a year, maybe $1.5 million a year in the day. And it was enough that Not only did I go to club, every sales engineer I worked with worked club. Everybody, like we just brought everybody on that deal. So that was a real team win there that just sticks out in my mind as a great deal.
Awesome. I know Stryker as well. They were the competition for the two companies that I worked at.
Oh, that's right. Well, you're in medical devices, so yes, you would definitely remember. And
Next one. What is one book or resource that you'd recommend to the Salesman podcast audience?
uh, this one is the easiest one for me because I am obsessed with this book. It's called Winner's Dream, and it's by Bill McDermott, and he is currently the CEO of SAP, but he started off running a deli for his family when he was in his teens, and it is his journey from a sales rep on to becoming the CEO at SAP. And the thing about Bill McDermott that I will meet Bill McDermott, mark my words. Bill McDermott, if you're listening, know that I am going to get on your calendar. Um, his optimism, his enthusiasm, his passion, his empathy, his integrity are just wonderful. And I would recommend listening. I listened to it on Audible or an audiobook because it's Bill McDermott, it's in his voice. And you'll just fall in love with the story. He's super, super inspiring. He is, in my definition, just he's a leader. He's a leader. He's inspiring. He's motivating. Great salesperson. Just, I can't recommend that book wholeheartedly enough. And I'm a huge reader. I read a couple books a week. So that's a strong endorsement that I pick him a number one.
Nice. Well, we'll link to that in the show notes over at salesman.red. It's a new one on me, so I'll check it out as
Oh,
well.
good.
And
Please.
next one. Who is the world's greatest salesperson?
Okay, well, unfortunately, that person I would have to say has passed on. But I would say, and it may be cheesy, my dad, and I'm one of 7 children. My father was an entrepreneur, and you wouldn't know this about me now, but I'm an introvert, number one. I'm super shy. Um, I never wanted to go into sales. Of all the things I knew that I would not do, that was a number one. And my father was the one that always said, "You'll always be selling, Bridget," and understanding that as a skill, as a life skill, is critical. And being able to sell someone that was the most resistant and were less likely to listen to a parent, especially at that age, I mean, for me, it was life changing for me, and it was fantastic, fantastic advice. I think any parent has to be a great salesperson. Raising children, you have to be a great salesperson.
I'm not there yet, so I can't comment on that, but
Trust
I know
me.
for
Trust me.
yeah, for my dad to get me to do anything, I'm so stubborn on occasion with certain things that he has to be a great salesperson. I've never thought about it like that before. I'll tell him that later when I ring him. He'll
Tell him.
he'll enjoy that. I'll tell him. I'll pass it on with love from you, Bridget. Okay, next
That's
one.
right. Please do.
What does the first 60 minutes of your day look like?
Got easy. And you know what? Me being a person of routine and discipline. So I get up every morning, 4:30 a.m.
Wow.
And my 60 minutes, I have a cup of coffee. I read I read the New York Times and then other stuff online. So the first part I do is I read, then I write in my journal. And then this takes more than 60 minutes. This takes a couple of hours. And then I go for a run. So I exercise. So that's how I start every day, so that by the time I get into the office, 7:30, that first 60 minutes. So that's how I start every day. But then my first 60 minutes at the office it's really around prioritizing. And I look at my schedule for the day. I always have a to-do list. I prioritize and reprioritize, and then I start the day. But I do that effort of listing what needs to be done, prioritizing, sometimes reprioritizing. I do that every morning before I start.
Nice. And is that something you've always done, or is that something that you've kind of learnt and developed over the years, this prioritizing? And then other people have said that, but other people haven't gone as far as, say, reprioritizing once they've kind of got a list.
I've definitely developed it over time, but it's been over, well, a long period of time. Okay, this is not my first rodeo here. So I would say over the last 20 years but I've done it for a very long time.
Okay,
Again,
let me change that then.
uh,
Has the way you plan and process at the beginning of the day changed in the past, say, 5 years, 10 years, with perhaps online tools, with the internet, with software? Has anything changed it, or you sat down
no,
with a pen and paper and just thinking?
it's let's say I use Evernote. It's this the important piece here is not the tool, it's
Mhm.
the thought process. And it's understanding how to prioritize, what to prioritize. I've gotten better over time at understanding, okay, this task that I allotted 30 minutes is really going to take 45. Or this that I think is going to take an hour, I need to get that done in 30 minutes. So I've gotten better at that over the years. There are tools that help. At most, I use Evernote, but the most critical thing is whether it's pen and paper or on a tool, it's the thought process behind it. And it is that effort of prioritizing, reprioritizing, prioritizing, reprioritizing that I think is essential. And that has not changed for me much over the past 5 years. Tools have not influenced it.
Nice. That's what I thought you were going to say with regards to the tools. That's what I was hoping you were going to say. And my experience is the same. I have this pad of you won't be able to see it if I held it up on YouTube, but squared paper rather than lined paper, and I just do little check boxes and then go back through it midday, see what I've done at the end of the day, and then I've got a couple of overarching goals, which is essentially all comes down to just growing the podcast at the moment. So I'm totally on board with you here. I don't use any tools. I use a calendar to plan things online and let people book them in and that kind of thing. But I end the tools at that front because, again, I think it's overcomplicated, some of the systems that people have set up, and the simpler I can make it, the more disciplined I can be with it, which is a recurring theme in this conversation, which I enjoy. And final
Well,
one, go on.
one interruption before you go to the final one.
Okay.
What you just described sounds awfully disciplined to me. So you may want to rethink your definition of yourself as not being disciplined. I hear a lot of discipline
Well,
in what you're saying.
let me tell you this then, and I'll keep it short because I'm conscious of time here. When I say I'm undisciplined, and maybe other people do this as well, so maybe I'm being harsh on myself, but when I say discipline, it means I've got to edit this podcast. So I've got to literally, I can't just sit down and do it. I've got to literally wrestle with my brain for a good 3-4 minutes, and then I've got to set a timer for 25 minutes, then have a 5 minute break. Timer for 25 minutes, 5 minute break. Otherwise, I just get lost in opportunities. So that's what, when I say undisciplined, that's what I mean in that context. That I have to, and it takes willpower. And by the end of the day, I'm absolutely shattered because my willpower's gone on like convincing myself to do all this work. So it always gets done. So you could say I'm disciplined if you looked at the results, but the process itself is something I'm always looking to improve.
It sounds like your mind wants to go free, but you've developed hacks to keep it
Mhm.
on track. I just think it's the way your mind works, and that's a beautiful thing. So your mind is very open to sort of what's happening in stimulus. And a lot of salespeople, that's what happens. They've got all this stimulus and they do a little of this and then they go do that and they do this and then they go do that. And that's what creates a lot of complication,
Mhm.
especially with tools. But you've created an interesting hack for yourself, which is, okay, I set a timer, I stay concentrated, give myself a break. That's a great hack that I think a lot of salespeople could really learn from. I think it's brilliant, Will. I think it's brilliant.
Thank you. I'll link to the software that I use. It's an app on my phone to do that timer. And then it also records if you want to get into data, which I don't ever bother with, but it records how many hours of work you're doing per day versus how many breaks you have and all that kind of stuff as well. I'll link to that in the show notes of this episode over at salesman.red. Final one, again, conscious of time here, Bridget. If you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give her to help her become better at sales?
Oh, have fun. Enjoy it. Like I feel like I always have taken it too seriously, especially early on in my career. And I don't think that is helpful. I think that created more stress and anxiety. Um, I would say have fun, learn from every mistake, be okay with mistakes, learn as much from winning deals as losing deals, and just relax and enjoy it. It's a great privilege to be able to help people solve problems, which is all you're doing in sales. You're just helping people identify and solve a problem that they have. And I would say, enjoy that process, understand it to be the privilege that it is to be in that unique relationship, and just have fun with it and learn from all of it. And it's a wonderful profession to be in.
Amazing. And I want a yes, no answer to this final question here, Bridget. Yes, no answer.
Okay.
And you're more likely to come back on the show in the future, so we can perhaps dive into this another time. But do you feel like if you had more fun when you were younger, do you feel like you'd still be in the same position that you are now? Because there's a lot of salespeople listening who aspire to sales management, VP of sales, those kind of positions in the corporate world. Can you take it just as seriously but have more fun and still, kind of step up to those positions?
Absolutely, 100% resounding yes. Resounding yes. I think that having fun is a super critical component. It lights up areas of our brain. It encourages teamwork. People are attracted to that. There's no question that it would bring more success and a super important component of management as well.
Awesome stuff. Well, with that, Bridget, tell us a little bit where we can find out more about you, because I know the audience are going to be super engaged after this episode.
Twitter. Luckily I signed up early enough that I'm Bridget Gleason, just as my name is spelled. LinkedIn, easy to find. Those are probably the best two ways to connect with me.
Amazing. We'll link to them in the show notes, again, over at salesman.red. And with that, Bridget, I really appreciate your time and your insights. I appreciate the fact that you're a practitioner in all of this. You've not kind of written a sales book 20 years ago and are trying to get speaking gigs still on the back of the sales book. You're kind of like foot in the trenches, and you've got a team together, and your insights way heavier for me and the audience than what a bunch of the guests that come on the show do. So I appreciate that. And with that, Bridget, I just want to thank you again for your time and for joining us on the Salesman podcast.
Happy to do it. Thank you, Will. It was a pleasure.
And there we have it. Bridget, thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate your insights, and I'm going to dive more and deeper into the practitioner insights alongside the consultative insights and alongside the authors and everyone else that we have on the show. I think that's an interesting twist that needs to be delved into further. I want to thank you, as always, Sales Nation, for tuning in. As I say, every episode, the show would not exist if you guys didn't both tune in and support it by sharing it with your colleagues and your friends. So I appreciate that massively, personally, from the heart. And with that all said, I'll speak with you all again tomorrow.